Hi guys, welcome back to the Anna-losophy Podcast. Today we're talking about John Rawls, one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century. Rawls was born in 1921 and lived through many events in modern history. He experienced the Great Depression, served in the Pacific during World War II, witnessed the rebuilding of nations after the war, and watched enormous and major political debates throughout the second half of the century. There were many questions about inequality, poverty, civil rights, economic opportunity, and the role of government that appeared basically everywhere. And by the time Rawls began writing, philosophers had already spent centuries discussing justice. Although some argued that liberty should always come first, others had different answers, like equality, economic growth, public responsibility, social welfare, just to name a few. Rawls, though, became interested in a question. Before arguing about taxes, political rights, healthcare, etc., how should we decide what fairness actually means? The word appears constantly in political discussions, but people often use it to defend completely different positions and viewpoints. Rawls wanted a way of thinking about justice that didn't immediately depend on personal interests or political loyalties. His most famous work, which I really recommend, is called A Theory of Justice. It was published in 1971 and really quickly became one of the most influential books in modern political philosophy. More than 50 years later, it remains a central and very important text throughout the world. Entire academic careers have also been built around defending, criticizing, modifying, and sometimes adding on to Rawls' ideas. Rawls began with an observation. An enormous portion of human life is affected by circumstances that nobody chooses. And that is because every person enters the world carrying a collection of advantages and disadvantages that arrive long before any individual decisions are made. Although some people can be born into wealth, others aren't. Some grow up surrounded by educational opportunities, and others spend years overcoming obstacles that were present from the very beginning. Some inherent talents that happen to be highly valued by society, and others work just as hard but receive very different rewards. The more closely you explore and look into human life, the more difficult it becomes to separate achievement from the circumstances that existed before achievement was even possible. Of course, Rawls didn't deny the importance of effort, intelligence, or ambition, but what really interested him was the fact that people begin life from very different starting points. Imagine two runners preparing for a race, and one begins right at the starting line, but the other begins 50 meters ahead. Now, both runners may work equally hard, yet the race itself has already been influenced before either person takes a step. Rawls believed that political philosophy often overlooked this, and discussions about success frequently focused on individual choices while paying less attention to the conditions that impacted those choices from the very beginning. This concern led Rawls toward one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy. Imagine that a group of people are gathered together before society exists. They have been given the responsibility of designing the basic rules that will govern the country they're about to create, and they must decide how political rights will work, what protections citizens will receive, and what obligations individuals will owe to one another. The society they design will eventually become their own, and their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren will live under the institutions they create. The decisions, in other words, made in that room will likely influence many lives. However, there is one condition. Nobody in that room knows where they'll end up once the society begins operating. Rawls called this condition the veil of ignorance. The people behind the veil understand human nature. That is, they probably understand things like politics, history, psychology, economics, etc. They know that every society contains differences. What they don't know is which positions will eventually belong to them, and every participant faces that same uncertainty or unpredictability. The rules they create might one day protect them, but those same rules might one day become the rules that they depend on. The discussion immediately changes though, because every proposal carries personal risk. A policy might seem attractive when viewed from a position of comfort, but it might appear differently when there's a possibility that you could spend your life depending on that policy. So that means the decisions can no longer be evaluated from the perspective of a specific social group because nobody knows which group they'll eventually belong to in the end. That is why and how the room becomes a place where unpredictability of your future circumstances forces people to think about what fairness is in a way that ordinary political debates didn't encourage at first. And that is the heart of Rawls' philosophy. But the second section is about actually designing that society. If you spend an entire year inside that room, the people gathered there understand that once the veil is lifted, the society they create will become their reality, no matter what demographic they're a part of, etc. Every law, institution, and opportunity structure will eventually affect them personally, at least to a certain extent. The challenge, though, is that they don't know which position they'll occupy when the process is complete. And this changes the tone of the conversation. Instead of asking what would benefit them right now, they have to consider what would happen if they ended up in any position within the society that they're building. One of the first questions concerns basic rights. For example, should freedom of speech be protected? Should citizens have the right to participate in government? Should people be allowed to practice their religion freely? Should the legal system treat individuals equally regardless of social status? These questions acquire a new significance behind the veil of ignorance because nobody knows whether they will belong to a majority or a minority. A person designing society from this perspective has a strong reason to support protections that remain valuable regardless of where they eventually find themselves. And the conversation gradually goes towards other topics as well. For example, economic questions begin appearing. How much inequality should a society tolerate? Should some people be permitted to earn more than others? Should private property exist? Loads of questions. And these discussions become very difficult because the participants understand that economic differences can produce both opportunities and hardships. Complete equality might limit innovation, but unlimited inequality might create a society where some citizens possess enormous advantages while others struggle to access basic opportunities. So the challenge is trying to find a balance that people would accept even while not knowing about their future position. Rawls believed that this pushes people toward being a little bit more wary of their situation. If you design a system while knowing that there is a possibility that you could spend your life among the least advantaged members of society, just speaking in overall terms, although the possibility doesn't guarantee that outcome, it does remain on the table throughout every discussion. A society that appears pretty good from the perspective of wealth may look so different when viewed from the perspective of poverty. A society that works well for the powerful may feel less appealing when there's a chance that you could spend your life without power. This idea eventually led Rawls toward one of his most famous conclusions. He agreed that inequalities could be justified under certain conditions. And that is, society doesn't need to make every outcome identical. People can earn different incomes and different careers can receive different awards. But the important question concerns what those inequalities can accomplish by the end. Rawls believed that social and economic advantages should improve the situation of everyone, including those who occupy the least favorable positions within society. So if an inequality benefits only a small group while leaving others significantly worse off, the people behind the veil would have strong reasons to reject it. What makes this argument very influential? It avoids some of the extremes that political discussions have throughout the 20th century. Although Rawls didn't propose a society where everyone receives exactly the same outcome, he didn't assume that any level of inequality is automatically acceptable, simply because it emerges from market forces at the same time. But his focus remained on being fair. The veil of ignorance then served as a tool for evaluating institutions by asking a question. Would rational people agree to these rules before knowing where they would end up within them? And that's why the thought experiment continues attracting a lot of attention, because it forces us to imagine society from a perspective that's difficult to maintain in everyday life. Most political debates begin after people already know who they are, where they live, how much they earn, what interests they want protected. But Rawls asks us to begin way earlier. He wants us to imagine that moment, before any of those details become known. And although it's just one condition, it's an important one, and it changes the entire conversation. But the third section is about Rawls' different principle. One thing I personally find so interesting about Rawls is that people often assume he was arguing for complete equality, but he understood that societies naturally produce differences. Some people, like for example, invent products that millions of people use. Some become surgeons, athletes, artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, leaders, etc. Different careers create different rewards. And that is why different talents produce different outcomes. So Rawls never suggested that every citizen should receive the same kind of income or live identical lives and have the same career. But what interested him was a different question. Suppose a society contains inequality. Under what conditions would that inequality be fair? And this is where Rawls introduces one of his most famous ideas, something called the difference principle. Imagine two different societies. In the first society, everyone earns roughly the same amount of money, and the gap between the wealthiest citizens and the poorest citizens is not that big, it's relatively small. At first glance, this arrangement sounds very fair because the differences are limited. Now imagine the second society. In this society, some people become extremely successful. Entrepreneurs build companies, doctors are doctors, investors accumulate wealth, scientists develop technologies that create entire industries. The gap between rich and poor becomes much larger than it was in the first society. And the conversation immediately becomes an argument about equality versus inequality. But the question that Rawls asks is a little bit different. What is life actually like for the least advantaged citizens in each society? And sorry if I sound weird right now, it's because of my pollen allergy, my bad. Suppose the poorest people in the second society still enjoy better healthcare, better education, longer life expectations, and greater opportunities than the poorest people in the first society. And suddenly, the discussion becomes a little bit more complicated because the larger inequality has coincided with a higher standard of living throughout society as a whole. And Rawls believed that this distinction matters a lot. His concern was never simply the existence of inequality, but his concern was whether the social and economic structure improved conditions for everyone, and that includes the people who started with the fewest advantages. If the gains enjoyed by successful individuals helped create opportunities that raised living standards across society, Rawls thought that the people behind the veil of ignorance might actually accept that arrangement. And this is one reason Rawls remains difficult to place politically, and people sometimes try to fit him into modern ideological categories, but he doesn't really stay there as 100%. Some critics believe his theory places too many restrictions on economic freedom, and others believe that it accepts more inequality than genuine equality would allow. But I think the fact that both sides criticize him probably explains why philosophers continue discussing him and people in general decades later. Consider something as simple as education. A child born into a household filled with books, parents with abundant free time, stable finances, begins life differently from a child who grows up without this. By the time both students enter a classroom, years of circumstances have already influenced their opportunities. Both of them probably have advantages and disadvantages, perhaps one that the other person doesn't have. Rawls didn't view this observation as an argument against hard work, though, as effort and responsibility and discipline still is important. His point was that people arrived at the starting line carrying different burdens and different advantages. And I think this idea continues appearing throughout modern political discussions. Debates about public education, healthcare, taxation, social welfare, and economic opportunity often revolve around questions that are quite difficult to answer. And his point was that I think debates about public education and opportunity revolve around questions that Rawls helped popularize. How much would society do to reduce disadvantages that come through no fault of an individual's own? And what opportunity should every citizen receive regardless of background? And honestly, I think that is a sign that Rawls was asking the right questions. What he provided was really a clear framework for thinking about them. He encouraged us to imagine what rules we would choose before knowing which group we would belong to. More than 50 years after A Theory of Justice was published, philosophers are still debating about the answers. Hi everyone, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the support, and it's been a lot to think about, so thank you so much for joining me in this episode. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!